Here is Anne Stanhope, the Countess of Chesterfield, Lady Chesterfield, widow of the 6th Earl of Chesterfield, and she is behaving in a certain way. She's not facing the camera, it's her profile, and she is wearing her morning dress. Now, there are certain elements here where we can see people and their behaviour. We've got that certain stern atmosphere about her. We've got the way she's poised. And we've got stories about her too. She was actually a friend of the politician Benjamin Disraeli. And after she had been widowed, Benjamin actually proposed to her, and he was widowed himself, but she declined, saying that people over the age of 70 would be foolish to marry. But also that goes into the social behaviours of what it was to be within the mourning paradigm. And these behaviours are thusly. So these behaviours have been outlined by Lou Taylor, and this is a culmination of acceptable behaviour. This isn't what people had to do necessarily. And I find that that's a certain thing which people do get a bit hung up about when it comes to mourning. And people believe that you must behave a certain way. But it's also expensive, and it's a certain thing which is very culturally identifiable. So it doesn't allow for people with other cultural differences or religious values. So yes, it was definitely a thing which maintained the social proprieties of the latter 19th century. But of course, it's not prescribed. It's not being enforced in a way which is shutting you out of society. It's just a way to behave. So very important to note that. Let's have a look at some. So widow for a husband, first mourning, 1 year, 1 day in bombazine and heavy crepe. Second mourning, 9 months with less crepe. Ordinary mourning, 3 months in black silk with ribbon and jet. Half mourning, 6 months minimum in half mourning colours. So a total of around 2.5 years. But of course, men had it a little differently, didn't they? They always do. So if you were a widower, and this is for a wife, you would have 3 months in a black suit with a black watch chain, buttons and tie. So not necessarily a great deal of effort, and that's 3 months. There was no second stage, there was no ordinary, and there was no half. A lot of that 18th century ceremony which the men had to adhere towards is lost here. And back in those days, it was more like a diamond integrated sword, or shoe buckles were very common. So if a mother or a child had passed, 6 months in bombazine and crepe, that's for first and second. Then in ordinary mourning, 3 months in black silk, and for half mourning, 3 months in half mourning colours, so a year. Child for a parent, black or white crepe for 6 months. Then in 3 months for ordinary, then half mourning, 3 months, so a year. So wife for her parents, 18 months mantle in parramatta and crepe, skipping over to ordinary mourning, and that's 3 months, and then half mourning, 3 months. So in total, about 2 years. So wife for mother-in-law is the same, 18 months mantle in parramatta and crepe, 3 months, 3 months, ordinary and half. For brother and sister, 3 months in crepe, that covers the first and second mourning, ordinary mourning, 2 months, half mourning, 1 month, and a total of 6 months. So niece for aunt or uncle, there is no first or second mourning, 3 to 6 months depending on how remote the relationship was. So in total, around about 3 months. And for a first cousin, first or second, nothing. 3 months ordinary, and that's stretching to 3 weeks to 3 months, actually. It could be anywhere between those periods. And the same for half mourning. So what we can take away from that is we have a social imposition, a certain way to behave. You needed to behave in a certain way because that's what was acceptable. And it would be disrespectful for anyone to see you in anything less. So there are so many avenues where people could exploit this, because you've got people locked up to 2 years or more in mourning. So they were dressing a certain way, they were behaving a certain way, they were wearing their veils, or they were wearing certain colours. They were adapting their fashion. Whether they were poor and they needed to dye their dresses at lower cost, they still behaved in a certain way. So that's where, from a business perspective, you look at these particular timelines and you start to think, so how could a business integrate with that, and how could the fashions actually adapt? And that was one of the downfalls of the mourning industry, actually, is that it couldn't adapt fast enough. There wasn't enough movement or flexibility within someone who's locking themselves down. And often when they did, this is for the rest of their lives. Just as we look with Mrs. Stanhope, she was locked down for the rest of her life in mourning. So some people did not emerge. And there are certain perceptions here as well, such as perhaps the wealthy widow was someone who was approachable because, well, she's available and she's been given an inheritance. So maybe that's someone to approach in terms of courtship because there's a monetarily viable outcome there, which isn't the right way to approach a marriage, I can tell you that. However, it was permissible for them to marry and to change and to grow out of these periods. And it was the decline of the industry, so post-1880s actually, when you've got about 19 years of people being in a rigid status of mourning, which this clearly shows. People wanted to change, people wanted to adapt, people wanted to move into new and fresher things, which without the dressmakers to adapt their fashion enough, because there wasn't enough stylistic change, it became very stagnant. And that is one of the main issues. It's not enough generation, but that said, for generation, there were certain amounts of revenue and volume of revenue into the hundreds of thousands of pounds, which people benefited from by exploiting people who are in mourning. By the way, these prescripted timelines, they date from around the 1876 to 1897 period. The mourning warehouses. Now, these were international. I've got a few here. I can run off a few. We've got Munro's Mourning Warehouse in Deptford. We've got Peter Robinson's Mourning Warehouse, who went through several locations, Regent Street and Oxford Street, also known as Black Peter, was quite popular. And between him and Jay's, they were two of the highest volumes in terms of business sizes and reach. They could reach internationally as well. They had massive businesses and they could spend a great amount of money just trying to basically out-promote each other. Their advertisements were powerful and their businesses were large, and they grew and they grew and they grew. There's also Sangster and Henderson's General Mourning Warehouse in Aberdeen, once again showing the reach. There's the Nottingham Mourning Warehouse in Nottingham, of course. But they are international, these places. There are mourning warehouses all over the globe, always to exploit the people who were going through periods of grief. They could also travel, and they could also bring with them samples, and they could outfit the entire house in all of the mourning trappings that you needed. But here, if you look at the advertisements, you can start to see all of their quality, and there's so much investment in the quality of what they were producing, and also the benefit of it being cost-effective and cheap. We start to see the way that they use the ladies in the imagery that they portray have modern fashion, and we've got, certainly you can see here the Mary Stuart cap, the veil as well with that, so we've got the pointed cap we can see twice there. We can see the veil on that wonderful hat at the top and the novelties of Jay's. They could adapt very rapidly, very quickly by integrating other fashion styles into the mourning accompaniment. And that way you could have fashion that was rapidly changing on a seasonal basis, and they could exploit that.